Okay, I think we're about ready to begin here. We're getting the microphones all set, and remember, it's probably best to sit over on this side over here. Before we begin, I was just noted that there's a pair of glasses that were left over kind of on the right side of the pews over here. Does anyone belong to these glasses? If you can't see the screen, that's probably why. So if you are losing a pair of glasses, then this is why. Also, before I turn it over to Dr. Pless, I just wanted to point out, if you are not a member of the Historical Institute, there are these cards on the back table, and on the back is a membership form, or you can just go to our website and become a member there, and that's even easier. So you can even buy 3 years membership, and you get a discount. So we got everything going. I think we have room for 2 more members, so you probably want to get in on that pretty quick. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Pless.
Thank you. We are just a little behind schedule, but really the day has gone so well. Thus far, the Lord has helped us. Dr. Mark Brown has been my colleague at WLC for now 20 years, and we miss him. He just retired, but he continues to do research in the history of Lutheranism and WELS history. He's by far the most prolific WELS writer of history in terms of just the sheer quality and amount of what he's done. Very much a published author, and we're so honored to have him here. And he's going to tell us about the history of the institution that is so near and dear to our hearts and what we're celebrating this afternoon, the WELS Historical Institute. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mark Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Pless. Does this sound okay? I couldn't tell which side is the top side. I think that's it. Yeah, it's okay. Well, in the discussion before, kind of informally, a lot of the things that I was planning to talk about will come up, so I'll try to figure out how fast we should move through some of this. I was asked to do this, and then I was asked at Forward in Christ if I could make a nice little short article about this, which should be in the October issue any day. And I think I got a little bit of the whole Bodding and Jekyll search through the attic a little mixed up in the article in the Forward in Christ. So think of that as an early draft, if I got that correct or not. So some of the things that we talked about before. And then what's going to happen is that this will in turn into kind of the final article, so to speak, that'll be in the historical journal. So what I've been able to do is go through the not just the journals, but also the minutes of the meetings and the correspondence. That's quite interesting. And then I've been following 40 years of the Missouri Synod in the Concordia Historical Institute quarterlies. I'm lucky enough to have all of them from 1926, except for a couple I lost someplace the last time we moved. So I'm still hoping they'll show up, otherwise I have to buy a couple more again, and that's going to bother me. So in terms of, is this, this should be working? Is Jeremy up there? It's the one that's worn off.
If you point towards the back of the church, that's probably the best.
If I what? Oh, really? Oh.
No, it's definitely the switch is on. Okay. I'll just put on.
It worked when we tried this. Why is this? Must be a church presentation. Oh, there we go. First of all, for beginnings, I think Pastor Elke already mentioned that there was this sense that, we ought to do this. There was a meeting in 1978 at New Ulm, and they said, we ought to start a historical institute. And so the first meeting was on October 28, 1981. Professor Frederick spoke on designing a WELS memory bank. This is interesting because it was a 2-page article in Northwestern Lutheran, but it didn't have everything printed. It was excerpted. But in the files, there is the original paper, in which he said a few other things that they thought were too hot to handle. For example, he said, The synod has already washed its hands of taking care of its own history. So I'm sure that had to get past some editor. So they probably thought we shouldn't say quite that much. Very good paper. Here is some members of the original board, and I don't know who this is. Do you know who this is with the arrow over his head? Tom Schultz.
Tom Schultz, yes, he was an editor of the newspaper out in Watertown.
Ah, okay, okay. And then the rest of these are all young versions of Cap. Arnold Lehman, Jeb Schaefer, and Mark Jeske. Here is, you can't see this real well, this was the original seal, which Mark shared with me a few weeks ago, which is kind of morphed into a slightly less complex one, but it's got the Salem Church on it. So the question came up, at what point did the Salem Church become the landmark church? When was that taken along with the work of, and the answer is I can't tell, and the people who go back can't remember exactly, but it happens pretty soon. Now, I think, and I think Cap has this theory too, that the 1970s were a time of great optimism in the Wisconsin Synod. We grew up, some of us, under every state by 78, and we were going to talk about our history. I'll never forget one pastor who filled out my survey years ago about breaking from the Missouri Synod. His line was, "It was so wonderful, it was like being a kid with swimmies on, and you take the swimmies off and you find out you can swim." That we as a synod could make it by ourselves. At the same time, there was a lot of historical writing, and I just have a closer picture of Edwin Frederick, because he did a lot of this writing in our quarterly in the mid-70s about the history of the synod. And his pieces and some of his other work led to the history of the Wisconsin Synod in 1992. And there were others who wrote. And so it would be a time when the WELS would want to gather and look at its history, which maybe we hadn't also always done. Now, I raised this before in the conversation. Was this the result also of some Missouri envy? Nobody has said this, but the more I read in the history of the synods, well, I shouldn't say the synods, Missouri typically doesn't hardly ever know what we're doing. But in terms of Wisconsin, there is a sense that we're always trying to catch up. And Carl Mischke did a paper in the 90s called 20 Years Behind Missouri. And his point in the paper was more that a lot of the temptations and sometimes bad ideas that come along in Wisconsin happened 20 years before. Now, we could also say that a lot of good ideas that we are following in the Synod for organizations and so on started there, and we just put a different set of alphabet, numbers on them. And in the case of the Historical Institute, they were way farther than 20 years ahead of us. The very personality of the two synods was that, as August Pieper said, we were kind of orphans. Wisconsin didn't know who we were, didn't know each other, whereas Missouri had such a sense of its history and its purpose. You go back to this book, Zion on the Mississippi, which is almost 70 years old, but it is still the most complete history of what happened roughly 1837 to 1843 when the Missouri group came. And he had so many records to work with. As I said, he took an archivist along. This is from Martin Westerhouse, talked about the immigration. He said, Marbach was appointed director of the manager of the whole immigration project with a set of guidelines. The advisory committee was resolved that there be a library, archives, and chronicles. So they had this sense of themselves and what they were intending to accomplish. So that was always there. In the time between Walther as a young man and the development of the Concordia Seminary in 1926, the final version out in suburban Clayton, they must have had these collections of papers some places. They were growing at some of the synodical schools like Concordia and the seminaries. And then when they built the building, they had this third floor room where it was just packed with stuff, and there got to be so much stuff that by the early 50s they said, well, they were saying it sooner, but they finally were able to afford a building of their own. And here was a dedication about how we're going to build this building, and here was the floor plan with rows of storage and a museum center and a reception center. I could not find a decent picture of the whole building. This is the entrance. And what they've constantly made reference to is we want this on campus. right by the seminary students so that they will become accustomed to coming over and doing research in the archives. That was said in our records very often for many years, although it didn't work out that way. And it's hard to say how much of a barrier that's going to be for STEM students to do research. There's also a museum, and they change displays in there, but perpetually Walther's carriage is sitting, you know, on the end there, and they have various things that they show off. And, you know, here is a picture, it's kind of a bad picture, of the board of directors of the Concordia Historical Institute in 1965. The first era there is over Karl Meyer, who did lots of writing, was editor of the journal, wrote a history of primary source documents. And this was, where's the next guy here? There is, now what is his name? He wrote the article about changes in the Missouri Synod. It's the most bravest article I've ever read. I can't think of his name. He was the editor for a while. And then over here is a young August Silfo. No, not him. He was gone for a while. Joel, you would know who he was. Yeah, his name is up there, but I can't hardly see it. Arthur Repp. Arthur Repp. Anyway, by this time, you know, the Missouri Synod was changing somewhat. Here's a picture of all the various historians and archivists from all over the country who came back to visit and talk about their work. And this is a picture of the annual Historical Institute Honors Banquet. And when you look at the picture, you get the sense that these are a lot of, you know, hoary heads who have supported this for a long time. And you notice over here sitting toward the back is Matt Harrison. I've been back to this for 5 times. There's always a synod president there and district presidents. And there's money that supports this, and maybe there weren't more than a half a dozen people in the world who would be really envious of this, but I was. And I used to wish, how could we get some of that into the Wisconsin Synod? I'm also, since I'm, you know, spreading the envy around, I'm pretty envious of the ELCA for this too, because they have regional archives in different parts of the country. Here's one of their archivists, Kathy Lundgren, Lundern, I guess. Lundeen. I don't know her, but I thought I should have her picture. This is in very close to O'Hare Airport. And of course, the ELCA is made up of lots of little Lutheran synods that had their own historical groups that kept up their history. And again, they have a staff of a half dozen people there. They have all this great working space, I would think. Oh. So the story of our archives really begins with Johannes Mühlhäuser, first president of the Synod, who in 1858 was requested by the pastors to write up a history of his time with the Synod. And for a while he wrote that, and then it was apparently lost for quite a bit of time. Arnold Lehman found it in an attic in Watertown in the 90s. It turned out to be a little bit less than what we thought. But a generation later, Professor Kaler, who was in at Watertown, was encouraged to write up a history of the Synod, and he was told that some of the stuff was in one of these parsonages. Was it maybe in Bodding's parsonage, which is on 8th and Valete, still there? Or was it at Pastor Jekyll's parsonage, which is across the street from Grace Church? And by the way, that's still there. I took that picture on Monday. That's where the president of MSOE lives now. That's his presidential mansion. And you see the dormitories behind it. And so they, as Professor Brenner mentioned this morning, that they found some of the papers neatly wrapped up and stuffed into the attic as insulation. And so Kaler wrote, Jekyll's attic yielded a basket with carefully arranged packages of letters. At Bodding's house, finally bundles of letters were discovered, wrapped in newspapers and stuffed between the roof and the attic. While Kaler ironed out and arranged the letters, Bodding, looking on, would read one or the other, offer bits of information that came to his mind. When, after 2 years they did this, they came out to about 4,000 items, which covered those first 4 decades. And of course, Kaler eventually wrote the history of the Wisconsin Synod, which is a really uneven piece of work. I mean, the first 2/3 of it is like someone's diary, and the last 20 years are much shorter takes. But then we don't really know what happened to all these papers all this time. They must have gone to Watertown for a while. I first saw them sitting on a table. It looked like a garage sale on the lower level of the Synod office building on 35th and North. And typically the seminary librarian became the archivist, so that would be Martin Westerhouse when he was there. He gave a presentation to the Concordia Historical Institute several years after this. He says, we need a full-time archivist. And we would continue, people who cared about this would continue to ask. The other man who did an awful lot of work in these archives is Norbert Manthe. And Professor Westerhouse was a librarian, and so he would understand archival work to some extent. Mr. Manthe pretty much was self-taught and just organized them the way he thought. And his article in 2000 is a good history of this. But then some other names come up. Professor Haneke, way back in the 1860s, got this role because he was the first SEM-Prof. And there is a Pastor Raymond Huth, and a Pastor Walter Hepner, and a Pastor William Schenck, who all did this voluntarily, who were not really trained for this, but had a love for this. I should mention that Professor Hartwig became the librarian, and so it fell to him when Professor Westerhouse retired. And then Professor Tiefel's son, Mark Tiefel, did us a yeoman service. He took an extra year off of seminary and received essentially a vicar's salary for an extra year of organizing the archives, and that helped a great deal to move them forward. Now here's Professor Haneke, here's Mark Tiefel, and I could not find a picture of John Hartwig anywhere online. So I used his seminary graduation picture. And he's aged pretty well, I would say. I saw someone the other day that I was in school with. I had no idea who he was. So some of us got as kinder to than others. And, they would talk about the work in the archives, and of course, Professor Hartwig and Professor Westerhouse got students to help. And one time in my president's message in the journal, I mentioned that these students were doing such a good job with the archives. John Hartwig says, don't say that. Every time we tell the Conference of Presidents or the administrators that students are doing a good job, they're going to say, see, you don't need an archivist. You're just fine the way you are. So I learned my lesson kind of the hard way there. So the archives were taken off that table on North Avenue, and I saw them sitting on a table for a while at 2929, and then they were moved ultimately to the seminary, where they were, a room was outfitted for that, and that was a considerable cost. And they got terribly overgrown. It had so many books, and of course one year there was a pipe that broke in there and nearly got things, fortunately, that did not harm those. Today this is the wonderful Visitor Center, which is outside the archives in the new Synod Administration building. And now there's this guideline of the kinds of things they're looking for. We've increased tremendously the number of papers and the organization of it. And I am so pleased that, I don't look like I'm so pleased because I got rid of her right away, that Susan Willems is here. All these other people who are archivists were kind of hobbyists and did this at their best. Pastor Schrader, President Schrader, actually offered me the job because he thought I was retiring, and therefore, I wouldn't have much salary, I think. And I said, I like being an archivist, but I don't know the first thing about this. And now whenever I see him, I say, you are so blessed that you've got her instead of me doing this. She does wonderful, wonderful work. So the journal, Professor Brenner gave us a very wonderful tour through some of the highlights. This again is the first journal in spring of 1983. It's a shame we couldn't have done better with Mielhäuser's picture there. And then there was the cover page with some of the articles that were in there. And then the second one was a rather difficult story about the parting of Kaler from the seminary, who had challenged some of the Synod's leadership, and that ultimately led to the Protestant movement. And by that time, he was getting to be an old man. But in the correspondence files, I found this letter written by a pastor who had had Kaler as a student, and he was pretty outspoken about his disregard for Professor Kaler. Kaler, I think, was a difficult person to live with. And his English and his German were equally hard to read, but all handwritten. But one of the things he said was, I heartily agree with publishing the main historical events of our WELS, highlighting doctrinal development, the stand of our WELS. However, the glorifying of certain men with full pictures as in the spring and fall journals of 1983 should be carefully avoided. Instead, the journal should present and publish the history and the outstanding events of the WELS. I think this was a very significant letter because of what it said about our church body's history. Now, I don't know if is John Robbie still here. I don't want to be mean here. But I've gone through the Concordia Historical Institute's journals, and I certainly haven't read every word of every page. But it is pretty highly complimentary to just about everybody except Stefan until about the mid-1960s. And then there was a different mood there where there was more of a critical view. But you know, the WELS has this sense we shouldn't glorify people too much. And from the very first journals, there were also articles about people that had difficulties in their ministry. And so you had articles about well-known presidents like President Brenner and President Naumann, but you also had the Ackerman story and how he challenged the draft board in New Ulm. Essentially, if I understand the story right, the local government officials said to the board, either you deal with them or we will. And his call was removed. You have this article that reviewed all of the suspensions from the Wisconsin ministry over the Protestant conference. You have articles like this, which are wonderful about mission work, like the 49ers story, and this article here about mission work in India, which must have been the Synodical Conference, where the one Indian person says, Christianity is a happy religion. You have this article about the Pastor Marmaduke Carter and African-American pastors up north, but you also have Tommy Burgess's article, the member of Siloa who did what was called an ethnographic review, where he simply told his experience. And it's tough reading some places to see how hard it is for black people to come to our white Lutheran church, even though we think we're trying hard. That was an honest piece. There was stuff about social history, Steve Gergel's wonderful work on the anti-Germanism in this country after World War I, and the story about Cap Elke and how he got in the middle of the contentious situation during the Vietnam War and was shot by a sniper. We have these very nice reminiscences about people, and readers always like these, about, you know, being in Professor Pieper's home and being, and so you have all this variety, and I love this summary that Cap Elke actually wrote for the first year. He said, especially rewarding is the opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of our WELS history. Certain themes come up again and again. Rather than a glorification of our past as the good old days, we see the story of frail, sinful people like ourselves. Our forebears struggled, they made mistakes, yet they share a common blessing, the Word of God. The Word brought these men and women forgiveness and the strength to carry on the work. Some things don't change, we still struggle. The Word is still our strength, our motivation. May God bless our work. That was really clairvoyant because he wrote that the first year. And yet that has been so much the mood of many of the articles. They are very honest, and we learn from that honesty. Now the museum, as I mentioned, I could not find that the original statement of purpose included maintaining a museum. This building had been here since 1863, I believe, and it, of course, is still there with some modifications today. It was worshipped in until 1977. There were a couple articles in the local paper about how we are trying to reclaim our past, and another one here about 1991, where we are restoring the Cradle Church. And it was pretty, what should I say, pretty attic-like looking at the beginning there. Things were left behind. The building was dedicated as the Landmark Museum in 1985. There's Pastor Jeb Schaefer as the preacher. There is Cap doing the rite of installation. There are the three officiants. Jeb Schaefer, we all called him Jeb, and Cap Elke and Pastor Namanson. And there's part of the crowd that was outside the building. As you said, they probably had to do it outside because there were too many to get inside, because it was very well attended. It's looking a lot better today. It's taken a lot of man hours of work, financial gifts, grants, And it really, I've been in a couple of times for events, you know, for like a talk here. Some people have gotten married there, I understand. And a desk downstairs, a work area down below. In 2013, it was recognized with this plaque as the birthplace of the synod on the 150th anniversary of the building. And there are still lots of groups that come through. This is a picture from the Mayville News in 1988 of a group that came to see the church. That's news in Mayville, I think. And I did not go into all the journals and add up all the numbers, but there have been thousands of people who have come through this building. And it gives them a chance to feel what this might have been like when this is all country fields and farmers and dirt roads and not part of an urban area. Hang in there, I'm not going much longer. We have gotten words of encouragement from the other Lutheran church bodies. And if you've gotten a sense that we don't, you know, that the WELS doesn't ever talk with people in other church bodies, there's a lot of conversations that go on kind of below the radar. And now we're in a stage where the presidents and officers of the synods are talking with each other. We are acknowledging each other's gifts, and I would say we've become cousins, probably. Brothers and sisters might be too much to ask in our history. So one of the people who gave us constant encouragement was August Silfo. The Silfo family is rooted in Freistadt, and they have a whole family of historians. I was honored when I gave a preliminary talk about my dissertation at the college, and a couple hundred people came there, and a whole group of Silfos came over to talk. That was fantastic to have them there. So we had asked him for advice even before the Institute started. He wrote this wonderful letter where he's saying, you've made a great start in 1980 when we first made contact with him. Wrote another one in 1982. He came back to give a very good paper to the Institute in 1989. And also, you can find some of the best statements about archive work and historical work in the Concordia's Historical Institute Quarterly. They are reports that were given to the members. They are speeches. Almost invariably, he wrote these. He's been a wonderful friend to us. So I mentioned that John Robbie is here. He wrote a wonderful letter of congratulations, if I can read this here. During the past 40 years, the WELS Historical Institute has grown to have a permanent archival facility, full-time archivist. Historians of the LCMS are grateful for the support and assistance we have received from the WELS Historical Institute. Also, as the editor-in-chief of the Historical Quarterly, our staff and readership are grateful for the articles that have been submitted by WELS historians to be published in our journal. We are honored to get the letter and honored to have him here today. We also got a letter, there's his letter. We also got a letter from Daniel Harmelink. He is the actual director of the Concordia Historical Institute. He also wrote a nice letter, oops, oh, sorry, wrong way here. In which he said, I was personally blessed to visit the archive soon after its relocation to the new WELS headquarters, and I am very pleased that so much important work has been done since then in the never-ending but joyful task of retrieving, accessioning, conserving, cataloging, and sharing these historical treasures. We look forward to strengthening our partnership in the years ahead. In addition, I can think of other people in the Missouri Synod that are part of the Lutheran Historical Conference who have encouraged us. This is Marvin Huggins, who worked at the Institute forever, it seems like. This is Catherine Galchut, who teaches, or Galchut, I think she says, who teaches history at Bronxville. And look at this, we've even got the Synod president here, who regularly shows up, who was a historian. I feel so small next to him. I like standing by him. I had a kind of large roommate in college for a year. I always felt really skinny when I sat next to him. That's what it's like standing next to Pastor Harrison, who's very interested in our work and our well-being as a synod. Then in the ELCA, this is Mark Grandquist. He was the past president of the Lutheran Historical Conference. He teaches at Luther Seminary, works in archives, and he wrote a letter also in which he said, it is particularly impressive to note your progress over these last decades. The recent development in establishing a fine permanent archives is in the encouragement of a professional archivist or publication program, especially your encouragement of younger historians and scholars are all impressive. achievements. You know, it reminded me sometimes of talking with people who have recently joined the WELS, and they're more enthusiastic about us than we are about ourselves sometimes. Maybe that's a good lesson for us, huh? But I've met historians and archivists from other part of the country that are part of the ELCA. This is Susan McCarver. She teaches in South Carolina, and she's been working with students for years in doing historical research and writing. This is Paul Daniels. He's at the Archives at Luther Seminary and was on the board. Also, this is Maria Erling, who's been at Gettysburg, and her father was there before her for a long time. This is Joel Thorson, who's at the Archives in Elk Grove, Illinois. I've contacted him numerous times for ELC information. He is Johnny on the spot. These people are cheering for us. They're supporting us. Now, you have to get used to some things when you go to conferences with them, because they all like Schmucker, you know. We didn't like Samuel Schmucker. We thought he was giving away Lutheranism. They kind of tut-tut when the name Walther comes up, but there's still a way to talk with each other and to benefit from each other, which is a really wonderful thing. Now, I guess the question I really have to ask is, does the past have a future with us? Are we going to care about this? Or is it something, we all heard stories today already about archival records that are thrown away, that are lost, that pastors thought they belonged to them instead of the church. Well, you know, a lot of people say there's problems with history. Here's a kid saying, Dad says, why did you flunk history? The teacher asked me about stuff that happened before I was born. How could I know about this? It's not relevant to me, huh? And then there's always the answer, well, I don't need to know it. I can just look it up on Google, which I can attest as a college professor does not help very many students. I will say to them, imagine the most awful book you've ever gotten out of the library. Even that author had to convince somebody it was worth publishing. But anybody can put anything on the internet. And if you don't have a sense of what you're reading, no wonder I got a paper once that said that the sons of God, Genesis 6, were aliens that came from another planet. If you'd looked in a book, you wouldn't have found anything like that. Now this cartoon, I cut out of the paper because it had reference to a specific student that I had at the time. And it's a little hard to see this, but this is Calvin who says, he's reading the question on the test, what was the significance of the Erie Canal? And he says, in the cosmic sense, probably nil. Then he says, we big picture people rarely become historians. And this student fancied himself as a historian, sort of an observer on the American scene, but he didn't care about details. He did poorly on that. And there's a danger in doing church history, too, of saying, I got the big picture. Someone told me about it. I don't need to look at all those documents and refine whether that's correct or not. And that's sort of summed up here, too. A new cartoon from the New Yorker that says, I'm concerned about my legacy. Kill all the historians. Now, it's probably not that bad in our synod, but let me tell you, it can happen and does happen that people will say to our historians, we don't want you to say that. And I would say, well, was it wrong? Well, that's not really the question. We just don't think that's a good idea to say, or that isn't what people think. Let me give you a couple examples. There had been a growing sense, some of you will get this more than others, that we talk about people in other churches either being weak brothers or persistent errors. There was a sense that you could only by definition be a weak brother if you had previously belonged to the WELS. And I don't know how that got out there, but it was out there. And I got a hold of Tract 10, written publicly in 1950 by the Synod, which said, encourage people to pray with their ALC grandmother. And of course, we never were in fellowship with ALC. And not to give the story away, but I even said to the person, this was published, and your father was the Synod president at this time. If this was wrong, he should have pulled it back, but he didn't want me to say this. I found out that I had let's call him an inside observer at the publishing house when my dissertation was being turned into A Tale of Two Synods, and that it almost didn't get done because one editor was concerned I didn't say clearly enough at the beginning that we were right. And then when I wrote something else which bothered him some more, he wrote to me and says, I don't think we can publish this. And I wrote back and says, don't. If you think my history's wrong, then show it to me. That's how history works. But if it's just bad politics, just, don't put yourself in that position. Don't do it. In the Missouri Synod, Dr. Robbie helped me a lot with this. I did a symposium paper here on what we learned from our fathers on education. And one of the statements I made was that we learned that everybody in the education business in our synod has a call, a divine call. Well, in the Missouri Synod, that's not often looked that way. In fact, they generally hire rather than call. But there was a time in the 1960s when a writer in Missouri was talking about the teacher having a call. So I referred to that article, which had been published in their publishing house. And when my article got to doctrinal review, this man wanted to kill it. And so we can't publish that. And Dr. Robbie stuck up for me and says, you got to understand the role of history and church historians. He's saying what actually happened. So, killing all the historians, it hasn't gone that far, but there are times when people would like to silence historians. I gave a paper in a pastor's conference about a leader of our synod. One of the men afterwards stood up and says, I don't like that you're even doing research on this guy. He shouldn't be published. He's bad for the synod. So this can happen. And maybe it's a validation of what you're doing. I don't know. Well, as I said, Concordia Historical Institute Quarterly has a lot of discussions about archival work, about history. And so I just tried to boil this down into a dozen brief statements, and I'll open it up to you. First of all, the Lord is the God of history, and so it's very easy to find numerous citations from the Bible that talk about remembering your past, not forgetting how God has been good to you. They're used often. There are many to choose from, just as there are many statements that talk about Luther and many others have valued history. A couple of articles were like 5 pages of just quotes from people that probably no one had ever heard of before, saying how wonderful historians and history is. I don't know if that really does the job or not. There's a wonderful line from Chesterton. He said, the job of a journalist is to tell people Lord Winston died, who never knew that Lord Winston lived. So there is this sense that maybe that didn't count so much. I think some people see an interest in history as merely a retreat into nostalgia, that they like to look at and touch these old things. I had I think he was an accountant, who got, in his office, he got this, very nostalgic magazine about American history and have these little knickknacks around. And the thing is, even these nice nostalgic pieces that are in the journals can lead some people to think. They think, well, no, why did they do that differently? Why is this way? And there's a place for them. Dr. Silfo, even one place, he said, we have to be careful that this interest in history doesn't turn into a kind of idolatry of our past. And he mentioned specifically about how big of a deal it was for people to collect pipes because Walther, loved to smoke in his office. In fact, he apparently killed one of his parrots in his office smoking so much. So now we're going to be just like him and pattern him. That's kind of dangerous if this gets to be idolatrous. We have to be careful that this isn't all glory to us in the highest, that we shall now praise famous men so much that we can't look at the weaker sides or the decisions that were not well made. And frankly, some people that we maybe even know and love think that our interest in history is odd, I know some historians who come from a family of historians, so their Thanksgivings must be really unusual, for all they talk about. But in my case, I think I talk to some of my nearest and dearest, and they really try hard to be interested. So what are you working on lately? And you start to say, oh yeah, really? Huh, interesting. And they can see them backing up because they're trying, but it just seems like this is unusual. Maybe we just have to live with that a little bit. Obviously, a very important part of doing this history is to learn lessons from the past, how the past instructs the present and gives us direction or tells us what to avoid in the future. This is painful. And yet even, Kaler himself, when he talked about the role of history, about this sense of constant self-examination, which is hard work. At the same time, we are encouraged as church historians that keeping the 8th commandment is a special challenge. I know that Professor Frederick used to say that. The thing is, Luther taught us in the explanation of the Lord's Prayer that we pray that God will Guard and preserve us so that the devil, the world, and our sinful nature not deceive us or lead us into misbelief, despair, or other great and shameful sins. And anybody is guilty or is in danger of a great and shameful sin. And we can find some salacious stories in church history. And we are advised to deal with those stories very carefully. You know, I think of the story of Noah and his 3 sons. The other 2 sons kind of walk in backwards and cover their dad up because they don't really want to look any more than they have to. And so sometimes we do have to, and I think there have been some articles in the journal and some church history papers that have dealt with tragic stories and yet have tried to keep the, what should I say, the nosiness to a minimum, have tried to learn and then let it go. A big question is, how do we know what we know? Student comes in the first day with a bright, shiny new $80 textbook, and because it's in the textbook, and it's the 17th edition, it must all be true. How do we know? How do we know what we know? What do we know is the basis for this? And I certainly had the sense when I was in grad school that I didn't know whether I had all the information. I had 14 boxes of papers in my dining room, but maybe the 15th box was out there somewhere. So you have to write on what you know, but what are our sources? The best article to read about this in the 40 Years of the Historical Journal is an article by Dr. Keeker in 1990, where he looks at some of the most hallowed stories of our history and see they were confused on the dates, or this couldn't have been right, or whatever. And he comes to some conclusions. He said, turn every page. Never think you've seen all there is till you've gone to the end. And double check all the sources and make sure you hang on to your sources. So this helps us do that. And what I would also encourage is what I would call the practice of disinterested history, not uninterested, because then you wouldn't do it, but where you go into history without a preconceived sense of what you think happened. Now, naturally, you are going to go to certain sources because you think that this is where you're going to find what you need. But it's all the things you find when you aren't looking and when you go into it without a sense of what I want to find that you'll find the most interesting thing. And I know that in that article I mentioned, Dr. Keeker, and I know that Professor Frederick both said this, you know, we might find out that we should have a better attitude toward Mühlhäuser than we thought we did when we get to look at his history. And I think there's some truth to that. I am thrilled about the young historians that I hear about that are doing this kind of disinterested, source-based history. I'm going to name some, and I'm going to be afraid I'll forget some. Steve Gergel, who did his wonderful piece on the German war against Germans. Chris Pfluger, who has written an interesting dissertation on the breakup of the synod, or breakup of the synodical conference. I don't know that everybody will agree with his conclusions, but he did his work on this. Tim Grunmeyer, who's done an absolutely wonderful piece in his dissertation that says the Civil War was far more of a determinant in where the Lutheran synods went than we've ever thought. That is really a whole new look at that information. Ben Phelps has put together this history podcast and having people on, and he just lets them talk and ask them good questions. Ben Schaefer, who wrote a wonderful paper and gave it here about giving women the right to vote. I remember talking about that with some of the ELCA people, and I quoted something about a source that said, well, you know, women don't really want to vote. Someone said this in 1908. They're not happy to have the vote. They want us to take care of it. And the ELCA person went, oh, you know. I said, no, that wasn't a church writer. That was the Atlantic Monthly. That there was that sense there that this just isn't their place. Peter Prange, who's written the first of 2 volumes on Walther, it's a biography of his life, but it's a wonderful demonstration of how during his life he always balanced the principle of breaking with the persistent errorist versus having patience with the weak brother. I would say a subject which is very welcome in some corners of our synod today, to go for that balance. And finally, doing history for us is an opportunity for gratitude and praise to God. I'm sure that in your own personal life you can think of times and say, I am so glad that God did not answer my prayer in the affirmative when I asked for whatever 40 or 50 years ago. If I would have married that person, if I would have made that career choice, if I'd have gone on this trip or that adventure, How would my life be different? And I struggled with God and was mad that he couldn't see it the way I saw it. The larger view, history is like these drone shots on TV that pull you back from the immediate and the moment and let you see the larger context. We still won't see most of the context because that belongs to God. So it is very well worth doing. And did I turn myself off? Maybe I did. Yeah. So that's where I got to. Now I know we got into some questions earlier today that were answered by the panel, and maybe I moved too fast through some, but what kind of time do we have left? We're probably late, huh? 7 to 10 minutes. Yes.
My question is, and I was a teacher, and I wish I would have known more history of sin when teaching. And I was wondering, I know teachers have a lot to do and it's getting bigger all the time, but is there any way some of the, how sin is started and things to be brought to the eyes of young people?
Well, you raised a really good question about what can we do with this history after we're done. Typically, among academics, they look down on popularizers, whatever their field is. You know, only we enlightened ones can understand this. We must use these 8-syllable words because that's just the way it is. But there's a growing number of historians who are saying we have to learn ways to make what we've done understandable and even attractive on a popular level. I don't know how many of you got through children's devotions by using Eldon Weisheit's little books, you know, the Kid in the View, you know, the Gospel for today, all little object lessons. A lot of them pretty good, some of them missed it. Eldon Weisheit also wrote a good little article about the value of popularizing our history on a level that people who are not specialists can appreciate and understand it. We see a lot of this in public media. I mean, people say they hate history and then they eat up every 30 for 30 that's on ESPN. These are historical accounts and they put the person into the context of the culture and the history at the time. It can be done. And even some of the podcasts where you get to listen to people in conversation, there are ways to do this. But I also think that for those of us who are involved in history, we tend to think this is like just about the most important thing after the Sunday sermon. But there are a lot of different oars that are pushing, that are, taking aim at pastors. And so when I was on the board for Lutherans for Life, we wondered why every pastor didn't know every method of birth control and how it worked and what was right and what was wrong and why didn't they know end-of-life issues. And the missionaries will come home and they will be appalled that people don't know all about the mission stories. And the people who do work in, counseling, we should, get more psychology. And I think the average pastor often has to decide what he's going to major in because he just can't do all of this. And so I think there's going to have to be a certain tribe that's going to try to work to popularize this, on a broader level. The fact that all of you are here on a beautiful Saturday afternoon when the Badgers are playing Notre Dame, it's probably not turning out well. Last I was listening, it wasn't turning out well. But I mean, there's so many other things to do. And you work hard and you'd like to take a Saturday rather than this. But this is reassuring that you have this kind of interest. Buy the journal. Encourage the people who are writing history. Put in a good word for this with other synodical people. It helps us understand ourselves. In some ways, it even keeps people who have some doubts about their own sin. It keeps them here when you understand the history of why they are the way they are and what they did. But thank you for the question. Yes, John.
Maybe I can follow up on that a little bit. I have on my bookshelf 3 volumes that were published over the years in our circles, aimed at grade school kids on the synod's history. And it takes teachers that are going to be willing to make that fit into the curriculum somewhere. We probably need, well, not probably, we need something that's updated. Last one I have is over 30 years old.
Yeah.
But quite frankly, when I was teaching seniors at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, I was always amazed at how little of their synod's history they knew coming into that class.
Yeah.
And I tried to do my best to try and get them interested in various aspects. Some of it worked, but again, I think there maybe is still a spirit among us that we haven't done things that are worth remembering. And maybe that's a spirit we got to look at.
Well, I think that's true, and I remember reading the August Pieper's reminiscences and found it very interesting that he was playing ball on a hot day and then drank so much water and got sick and thought he was going to die. He suddenly became far more human to me, even though this is the kind of experience we all go through. Some of these histories that we read in big books were actually serialized originally and had a little piece coming at every time. Maybe smaller bites is a good answer. There's still a feature in Biblical Archaeology Reviews that shows some unusually weird-looking object that they dig up, and then they say, "What do you think this is?" Well, who knows what this maybe is? I mean, Dr. Brug would always say, if you don't know what it is, say it's a worship object. You're probably right. And there's some truth to that. But I mean, there are people who are finding ways to popularize their field. And even though you may not like Bill Nye, the science guy, too much for his actual beliefs, his approach is worth looking at, to think of the average person. Cap.
Thank you very much, Mark, for a very, very good presentation. Along those lines, many people today are more visual as far as their learning goes than reading a book. And a number of years ago, I worked on a script for the 150th anniversary of the Synod.
Yeah.
Harvest of Joy. It was put on video, and those videos now are getting pretty grainy. And while working on that, and for other things too, I looked at old footage from Hanukkah in Africa and things like that. The old film, you know, the reels.
Yeah.
And that stuff is getting pretty old. I wonder how much can be salvaged of that kind of thing. It's being done, and I don't know that we are doing anything in that direction.
Yeah, you know, we've got someone in our synod like Steve Betcher who is so good at that. And he's been a real helpful, loyal member of the WELS and stayed here. But I think the whole country caught on with Ken Burns and what he has learned to do with making still pictures move and, you know, the way he edits his old films. And again, you know, a lot of people still, you know, you can either, you know, have a colonoscopy, you can watch PBS because they're not, either one's very attractive, but to them, and yet people sometimes find a lot of these stories are really, they touch them in different places. And there's got to be a way, and it can't, I think people like me need other people to translate me, you know, for different readers. And so it's well worth talking about trying to do more than we have. I mean, my PowerPoint here was very typical of how I teach today. I have very few words, lots of pictures. I need the next picture to remember where I am. But then it's much more back and forth, you know, than it used to be. So.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, thank you very much for your patience, to be in for a long afternoon, and for your interest in this. And you know, Christmas is coming. You can always buy a subscription to the journal to a friend, a child, a grandchild, and then, you know, ask them about it after they get it. But we should keep going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we have come towards the end of our day together. But I can't think of a better way to celebrate the history and of God's grace to our synod than worshiping Him. So we're going to end with Carl Nolte leading us in a hymn sing, and that will be done over in the Landmark Church together. But before we go, I think we need a tidbit of history. Professor Pless, could you give us another tidbit?
Thank you. Just want to point out that across the street would be the site of the log church where the Wisconsin Synod was founded, but really, the Synod as we know it today, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, that really started that in terms of its organization, August of 1917. And really, one man that made the joint synod work was Pastor Bergerman, and he was synod president for about a generation, and ground zero for really the joint synod would be his congregation and his parsonage, St. Peter's in Fond du Lac. So thank you again for your interest in WELS history, and now we have an opportunity to lift our voices in praise of the Lord of history. Thank you. See you over at the Landmark Church.